Thank you all for coming. My name is Mouhcine Guettabi. I'm an assistant professor of economics here at ISER. And I'm going to do the preemptive. I apologize, this is going to be immensely disappointing because this is a work in process as opposed to progress. So bear with me. I'm still thinking through mechanisms and how to explain quite a bit of the findings, but I would welcome thoughts that you may have. So the presentation is a bit unusual in that I'm going to be talking about two separate papers, one that's looking at the economic implications of the Red Dog mine on Northwest Arctic Borough, and the other one makes the argument that we should be looking at who actually benefits from oil price increases, and the case study there is the North Slope Borough specifically. And then I'll talk about what I do and what I don't do, and some of the assumptions that are going to seem unrealistic and that you can tear apart. But so if you allow me to digress just for a second, my training as a regional economist essentially focused quite a bit on this idea of place-based policies versus people-based policies. And that's really one of the concepts that initially drew me to the field. And what I mean by that is we divert quite a few resources every year in trying to steer companies to particular locations. And one of the reasons why we do that is we believe that if companies, for example, were to move to disadvantaged areas, for example, then the residents of those areas are going to benefit because they're more likely to be employed, they're more likely to improve their standard of living, right? And so the neoclassical explanation says, well, time out, we really shouldn't be diverting resources, because if people are perfectly mobile, and if migration costs are essentially negligible, then people should just go seek out opportunities elsewhere, and we shouldn't be actually moving companies to disadvantaged areas. Now, that's the broad lens through which I see this question, right? And so if we have an area that's dying, or if we have coal counties, for example, in the lower 48 that have become decimated, should we be diverting resources to some of those places if the original residents of those places would potentially benefit from a new plant that were to open, right? And the literature on this stuff is very mixed, right? And so when, for example, there is development close to a metropolitan area, most of the work seems to find that the new jobs are absorbed by commuters, meaning that you build a new plant in a place that's close to a large metropolitan area, people start commuting to it and take the jobs. And so if your goal initially was to improve the welfare of the people that were from that specific location, then you didn't really achieve the goal that you wanted. However, there is research that says actually in isolated rural areas where people are less likely to want to move, that are remote from metropolitan area, where the commuting is potentially more difficult, if you have development, then the likelihood of the benefits accruing to the original residents are potentially higher, right? Now, clearly the Alaska situation is slightly different, and we're not talking here about actually trying to induce somebody to go locate in either the Northwest Arctic Borough or the North Slope. What we're talking about here are resource development projects that are obviously very large in scale, and the benefits from those projects have been seen throughout the state. But the question that I'm asking is, are the residents that are spatially proximate to the resource, or the original residents of the place, benefiting from this development? And can we use standard econometric techniques in order to potentially answer this question? Like I said, the answer is maybe, and we'll walk through whether or not some of this stuff is credible or not. So again, that's the broad landscape through which I see this, And then obviously as an academic, I think that there is a hole in the literature that's fairly large because most of the recent work on resource development kind of just completely glosses over this idea of accrual of benefits. They say, all right, this place has grown by this much, but they don't talk about who actually is getting the jobs, who's becoming better off, who's becoming worse off. And so here in this first paper, I basically just focus on the Northwest Arctic Borough, and I try to identify if the Red Dog mine has resulted in a change of path of growth for the Northwest Arctic Borough. Clearly, it wouldn't have existed had it not been for the mine. Clearly, there are effects that are very well documented. Here we step back and we say, let's try to approach it from a data-driven standpoint. Let's try to imagine a world for the Northwest Arctic Borough where there wouldn't have been a mine. And then say, all right, how is the path, the current path, by how much has the current path diverged from the path without that mine, and let's attribute whatever that difference to the existence of the resource, essentially. So this is a little bit of background. I think everybody knows this that's in the room better than I. And so clearly we have a fairly unique situation. We have villages that are comprised of about 8,000 people, and about half of whom live in Kotzebue, and the rest are dispersed throughout the region. This is a little bit about the mine, and again, I think that most people here in this room are probably more familiar than the Red Dog mine than I am, but NANA the regional corporation has a very unique relationship with the mine in that there's been a very strong, well-documented commitment to local hire, and there's been an attempt to ensure that some of those benefits do actually accrue to the residents, right? Sharman Haley, a former ISER faculty, had done an analysis that basically showed that that commitment has resulted in considerable hire of local residents. However, there were still barriers to employing people at higher upper management levels. And then McDowell did an analysis a few years ago that found something like 57% of all the workers are NANA shareholders. However, only about 110 of the 610 people that are employed either directly at tech or at some of the service companies are residents of the borough itself. So they haven't reached 100% shareholder employment, which was the goal, but there seems to be evidence that, unlike a lot of other development areas, that there is an actual concerted effort to ensure that some of the benefits are accruing to people. So I'm not going to bore you with this stuff a lot, but I just want to explain just in very rudimentary ways what is it that I'm actually trying to do. What I'm really trying to do is create a twin for the Northwest Arctic Borough based on its characteristics before the actual mine existed, right? And so all of this says, and you can ignore the details, is that it says we have basically a set of boroughs in the state, and the Northwest Arctic Borough is my one. That's the one that received the mine, and I'm going to have an intervention in this case in 1988. Although the borough started production in 89, I'm going to start the intervention in 88, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. And then I'm going to be trying to look at how the outcome of interest, for example, employment has evolved over that time, or income, or whatever variable. Now, the difficulty in this question is really this, right? And so the real question, both econometrically and from a development standpoint, is the true effect of the mine is what the employment, for example, with the mine is, right, in the Northwest Arctic Borough, minus how much it would have been had the mine never existed, right? Now, clearly, we never see this at the same time. We never see both of these states of the world, right? I either see that the mine existed or the mine didn't exist. Now, thankfully, there are some very smart people that have come up with ways of trying to estimate or recover what this would have looked like in that Northwest Arctic Borough. Now, how do we do that? Very simply, we use all the information in the rest of the state, right? And so when I say, all right, there are all these other boroughs that did not receive this particular treatment, i.e. the creation of a mine, and let me try to basically construct a twin of the Northwest Arctic Borough based on some characteristics before that intervention, i.e. the mine, and ensure that the Northwest Arctic Borough and a weighted average, so this is nothing more than a weighted average of the other boroughs that were not subjected to that intervention, that hopefully mimic the behavior of the Northwest Arctic Borough pre-intervention, right? And so, and I'll show you what this looks like. And so it basically just says, all right, I have this thing that happened. I don't know how the world would have evolved in the absence of that particular mine. However, I have all these other boroughs where there is no mine, so let me try to use information from those other boroughs in order to construct a unit that looks as much as possible like the Northwest Arctic Borough before the mine was created, and therefore the difference, essentially, between the outcome that I actually observed, right? So this is, for example, employment in the Northwest Arctic Borough in 1992 minus the weighted average of employment in that twin would give me arguably the effect that I'm interested in, which is what is the actual effect of the mine itself. Okay, so that's essentially what we're doing here. And I'm gonna skip this because I think I've bored you enough. I saw a couple of people yawn, so just don't walk out. But and one of the neat things here is that for those of you that are so inclined, and typically most of this work is done in difference and difference equations, and one of the benefits of the synthetic control rather than difference and difference is that the coefficient on the unobservables is time varying. So if I were to drop this t here, then this would essentially just collapse to a basic difference in difference equation, which is what we typically use in trying to estimate these counterfactuals or how the world would have evolved in the absence of whatever particular intervention. So we do that, we construct this counterfactual for the Northwest Arctic Borough post the mine. And then I go through this exercise where I'm essentially saying, but I don't know whether to believe those findings or not. And so what I'm gonna try to do is I'm gonna basically use as much information as I have in my data, and I'm gonna be applying this quote unquote intervention, a fake intervention, to each of the units that I have in my analysis. Now, the real Red Dog mine only happened in one place, right? And so one of the questions that I pose is, if I were to construct this twin for every other place in my data set, I should, in theory, if there were no shocks that were happening in any other places, the gap that I get between my actual Northwest Arctic Borough and the synthetic that I get should be larger than any of the ones that I observe in some of these other places. Okay, and then I just go through it and I say, I'm gonna calculate the mean effect of the Northwest Arctic Borough's outcome of interest minus its synthetic in the post-intervention. So this is post-88. So this is what I actually see. These are real employment numbers. These are the constructed employment numbers that give me that synthetic. This is for the post-intervention, and this is my actual mean actual before the intervention minus the mean synthetic for the Northwest Arctic Borough. And I do this for every single unit, meaning every single borough, and then I rank them, right? And so, and ideally, if the effect, in theory, was largest or most pronounced in Northwest Arctic Borough, then the ranking of the Northwest Arctic Borough should be very high, right? Meaning the gap that I observe should be one of the highest. And I'll talk about why that's not entirely potentially relevant here. And just bear with me. Maybe. I said I'm gonna try to convince you. You can dismiss me, but I'm gonna try. So I'm gonna skip this as well. I'm going to walk you through the results. I'm using Bureau of Economic Analysis data, personal income data, by place of residence. And so I'm going to walk you through 3 measures of dependence. I'm going to walk you through 3 types of outcomes. The first one are what I define broadly as measures of dependence, meaning how dependent are the residents of the Northwest Arctic Borough on transfers, on federal transfers, state transfers, and employment insurance, meaning that's, in my mind, an indirect way of investigating whether or not the welfare of those residents. And I see Alyssa is here, and I was reading your thing that you did about the Northwest Arctic Borough a few years ago, and you mentioned that I think 32% of the people were receiving transfers or something along those lines. And those transfers are basically a fairly decent measure of wage and salary opportunities, because receipt of transfers is indicative of lack of opportunity. So if transfers have gone down, then I could potentially say that people are better off, right? And so we'll talk about measures of dependence, and then I'll move on and I'll talk a little bit about some employment. I'll talk about earnings last, and then I'll talk about population, which is partially problematic. But so this is what we're talking about. So what you see here, so the straight line are the actual per capita transfers in the Northwest Arctic Borough, okay? And these are logged, and then over here is the summary if you want to skip what I'm talking about. So this is the evolution of per capita transfers in the Northwest Arctic Borough, and what you see here are the synthetic construction, right? And so this is the dotted one is the constructed Northwest Arctic Borough, and this is the pre-intervention period. I only have good data starting in 1979, and so essentially my pre-intervention time period is 79 to 88, right? And then so I'm trying to mimic the Northwest Arctic Borough's behavior as a combination of these units. Now, and this is completely data driven, right? So I'm not selecting, so this is basically telling you that the Northwest Arctic Borough is best recreated in pre-intervention in terms of per capita transfer as 60% of Casilvac and 35% of Yukon. Yeah.
Are you using just all pre-intervention outcomes?
I'm using essentially just the lagged outcomes, yearly lagged outcomes, because I have nothing, right? And that's one of the questions actually that I potentially want feedback on, because I end up matching each variable on just its pre-intervention outcomes, and I'm not sure whether or not it may make sense to match everything on the same outcomes, meaning all the outcome variables on the same pre-intervention characteristics. So anyway, this is essentially telling me here, and this is just the difference between these two lines, right? And so rather than looking at the actual and the synthetic, you can look at the difference between those two lines, and what this basically tells you, as you can see, is that it appears that per capita transfers dropped quite a bit post-intervention. Now, one of the issues is when I go, and this exercise here essentially does this synthetic creation for every single borough in my data set. And then this rank looks at whether or not the difference in per capita transfers in the Northwest Arctic Borough were the highest among all of these. So I only have 18 boroughs that have perfect data from 79 to 2013, and those are the ones that I'm using. If I were to just rank them, the Northwest Arctic Borough is 14th out of the 18th, which means it didn't have the most pronounced difference between post-intervention and pre-intervention. However, it's 4th from the bottom, and this is one of the points that I want to make. So if we were to go just purely econometrically, I would say this is not statistically significant because its effect is not the largest. Now, this tells me that out of the 5 units that had actual declines in per capita transfers, the Northwest Arctic Borough was 4th. And more importantly, I have in this analysis the North Slope, the Matsu, which are problematic, right? And so, because the Matsus benefited a lot from development in Northwest Arctic Borough and the North Slope, and the North Slope arguably can't be thought of as a unit that received no shocks and therefore could serve as a good control. So just keep this in mind. In my estimation, and this is the effect in dollars, right? And so per capita transfers were almost $7,000 per person post 1988. And that tells me that there would have been, that per capita transfers would have been $430 higher in the absence of the intervention, or in the absence of the red dog mine, which means that we can arguably recover how many fewer people would have, or how many more people, I should say, would have been receiving transfers had it not been for the mine.
Mouhcine,
Yeah.
is it possible for you to do the D&D rank on a yearly basis?
I
And
can.
the reason I ask is because with the D&D that you're reporting, that's an average over all post-intervention years. If you look at just pre-2000, I mean, there are years that it looks like it could be significant.
Yeah, no, it's true, and that pattern is consistent across a lot of different dimensions. It seems like something's happened post-2005 or 2008, and some of them where the effect weakens quite a bit. And I don't know whether that's statewide things, but I mean, that's a good point. Like I said, the two main elements here that are worth thinking about is the control units, and then this time element that you mentioned, which could potentially be interesting. But like I said, I'm still interpreting it, although, like I said, purely econometrically, one would say I have to dismiss it. I'm still interpreting it as a decrease in dependence. Go ahead, Bob.
So, because this is sort of focused on the place-based, that
Yes.
doesn't it miss the dependence that is people-based? So, if, for example, Fred, who had some transfer money, gets a job and moves to Matsu, his the lack of or the benefit of his being less dependent on transfers is missed if there is some migration that's related to employment.
I'm going to come back to the migration component. So, because I have absolute amount of transfers. So you're saying that the transfers could be decreasing. Because, so there are two channels through which the transfers could be decreasing. It could be decreasing because people are moving out.
Well, it doesn't. It has to be somebody who previously.
No. But I mean, so just.
Well, yeah.
This effect is comprised of two things in my mind. Transfers decreasing because there are fewer people that are dependent and staying, and therefore there is less money coming in, right? Or people that have become better off because now they're making $100,000 and they've left. And this is a composite of both.
Right, but there could be a creaming issue. That is to say.
Explain.
That is.
I'm intrigued.
Are you not familiar with that term?
I'm sorry, Matt. I know. I told you this is going to be very disappointing. So.
The creaming issue is that if the people with the job, if there's a preferential migration by people with the jobs moving out, then in fact what you tend to be taking is the people for whom the decrease in transfers is most specific are correlated with the migration.
But if the ones that are better off are the ones that are moving out, what transfers were they getting?
Oh, because this is absolute numbers, you mean?
No. But I'm saying if the well-off people are the ones that are
Fred
moving.
is living on if I don't know who Fred is, but if maybe we'll use a Bob. If there's a Bob living on getting a lot of transfers, but getting unemployment,
Sure.
a bunch of stuff.
Yep.
They get a job and then move to Wasilla, then isn't that decrease in transfer missed in this analysis?
I don't think so. I think that because I have the absolute amount, I'm saying that this
Okay.
is a composite of both.
Okay,
I have the
get that.
absolute amount of transfers,
Right.
and this arguably is capturing either I've stayed and I'm receiving less transfers, or I've moved out and I'm no longer receiving transfers. In both cases, the absolute amount of transfers has declined,
Okay.
right? And so I can't decompose how much is each. But so this is an alternative measure, income maintenance, that has these things in it, right? And so essentially capturing a similar aspect of this. And I'm just kind of ensuring, I'm trying to dot my I's and cross my T's using these alternative measures of dependence. And this is what I'm finding. So again, same explanation. And this is again, third from the bottom, which means the third most significant decline in income maintenance dependence, right? And the only two places that are above it are these two, that are better than, meaning that have performed better than it, where the declines in income maintenance were more pronounced. Yep.
When I look at that figure, I see that suggests to me that the red dot line had no effect.
Why?
Because at the event date, it continues to map the synthetic.
Yeah, but the dependence obviously is not going to materialize immediately. Think about either employment directly in the mine, or think about indirect jobs, or think about the borough getting money from, so think about Nana getting money from the mine and therefore building a school or roads, right? And so to whom do those benefits accrue, and is there a lag, right? And so, because the maintenance is not gonna, so just for reference, roughly 50% of the people in Northwest Arctic Borough are still working for local government, and altogether, tech employs 610 people, right? And so that doesn't mean that every single person that was living there has all of a sudden started making $100,000, right? And so there are trickle effects that are being picked up by this, and there is really nothing that would explain these declines absent the mine, right? And so it's not like it was receiving a shock that was different every single year. And so again, that's my interpretation of it, is that again, a fairly non-negligible decline that stays there. And in terms of interpretation, you can see on the right-hand side, that's my interpretation of it, is that arguably we can back out how many fewer people would have been receiving some sort of income maintenance.
You see, guys, so real quick, and I just follow up real quick. So two things. So, I mean, when I see that kind of dramatic drop in the treatment effect there, you know, it's likely that it has something to do with the red dot mine. I'd say it's likely. It's just it's not as a bulletproof story, given that you don't see this treatment effect take effect at the event date.
I disagree, but fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that being said, potentially one thing that could help explain that is that lead prices and zinc prices went up significantly in the mid-2000s. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
But that wouldn't have had an effect if there wasn't a mine.
No, exactly. No, so I'm saying that it, at the end of the day, is still a function of the mine. It's just
Yeah, no, I'm certainly, and I mean, that's something I say at the end. I'm not trying to explain mechanisms as much, right? And so this is basically, think about it as a first shot, an exploratory attempt to look through whether or not we can actually attribute something to the mine and figure out how much better off people are. Yeah, either or.
Do you have employment data here as well? I mean,
I
are
do.
these numbers pretty consistent, like people dropping off from transfer payments? Is it?
I have employment numbers. I'll show you in a minute. Yeah. I have employment numbers, and we can talk about. Yeah. So I find employment effects. I don't know whether they're as big as one would expect, but yeah.
I'm just wondering your thoughts, and getting back to maybe an earlier point that you made, your thought on the fact that the donor units are all different for this outcome versus the other one.
Yeah, and like I said, that's one of the reasons. So I started this exercise saying, by using multiple measures of dependence, I'm able to capture this well. Then halfway through it, I went, well, maybe the story is inconsistent, because the numbers are also inconsistent, right? And so in one, we saw the decline was $400 per person. The other one is $120. And so what's comforting is that the direction is the same, right? And so it's two things. I'm thinking either that basically pushes me towards creating intervals of dependent by how much, right? And saying, yes, acknowledge that there are two different pre-intervention characteristics, and these are the effects. Or do one of two things. Either restrict the donor pool, meaning use the same units for everybody, or use the same pre-intervention characteristics for everybody. Basically just lock one of the dimensions of variation. This is
What is the donor unit?
the other boroughs from which I'm pulling information, right? And so in this case, for example, I'm constructing this counterfactual based on these, right? And so so everybody that's not the Northwest Arctic Borough is a donor or part of the group from which I'm pulling. And then the combination of these 5 matches the Northwest Arctic Borough pre-intervention the best, right? And again, I'm not selecting these, but I'm allowing the data to basically construct this as much as possible. One of the things that's, I guess, comforting in a way is that this seems to be matching the recession. And so this seems to be picking up the fact that unemployment insurance in the 80s went up quite a bit. But again, same story. There seems to be, it's a very noisy series, as everybody knows that's looked at it. But there seems to be a decline. So that basically tells us that unemployment insurance per capita would have declined by about 10, or would have been 10% higher in the absence of this particular mine. And again, part of this is I want to try to recover how many fewer people are on unemployment insurance as a result of the mine, if we believe.
Claims, or is this dollars?
So this is dollars. Those are dollars. That's why I'm saying I'm going to try to recover, right? And so I have dollars, so I don't know the number of people. I mean, arguably you can construct the number of people from the dollar amount, and then I would use the difference in dollar amounts to say this is how many fewer people are now receiving them. Yeah, but it's all dollars. Yeah, it's dollars per capita there.
One of the things that I think might matter is the big spike that you see there in the end. We had extended benefits for so long because of the national recession. We got so much more money, but claims didn't necessarily, like the paid number of claims didn't necessarily go up.
So
if you
length of
claim-
unemployment.
Yeah, length went up, but the number of people didn't necessarily go up.
Is there a reason to believe that the length of unemployment would have evolved differentially across boroughs? Because I mean that would be that would be the reason to be doubtful of this, right? I mean, if that's the case, then yeah.
If there's a variation in employment.
Oh, of course, no, absolutely, no. But I'm saying if there is evidence that the length or the duration of unemployment varied a lot, or that there was something specific to the Northwest Arctic Borough, then maybe we could explain something. So yeah. This is average wage and salaries. And Alex, here you go. Average wage and salaries, they go up immediately after 88. This is just for you. I did not have it. I just estimated this since you asked that question. This is the dollar amount that I'm attributing to this. So
all those years, immediately after where you see the effect,
yeah.
It disappears right around you see the effect in the others.
Yeah.
Pretty close, right?
The others, the effect is in 2000. Yeah, it's earlier.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They're different things. And again, I mean, these are noisy series. And again, one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of average wage, because this is such a small place, so the disappearance of just a few really high-paying jobs just moves this stuff so much, right? And so I think it's important to look at, but it's tricky to interpret. Total employment. This is what I'm getting in total employment. This is what I was talking about a second ago. So again, fairly large effect to start with. If I were to recover a job, number of jobs, this average looks smaller. So for example, the McDowell report showed, I think in 2013, they attributed, I believe, 715 jobs to the mine. They said, I think it was 610 directly, and then another 100 and some. Obviously this decline here makes the average lower, but it's pretty robust in the middle of that period, and a fairly large number of jobs that seem to have been created directly after. And again, this is the thing that I was talking about. So look at one of the donors here, or one of the units that I'm using to construct this is the North Slope Borough, which means that this gap arguably would be a lot larger if I were to drop the North Slope Borough, right? And so if I'm not comparing it to the unit which has also potentially benefited from a resource, then I would be finding something different. But again, I'm thinking about this almost like, I'm thinking about this as a conservative lower bound estimate, right? Or lower bound estimates across the board that give us a sense of whether or not we can recover some of these effects using some of this data, and whether or not we can construct units that are credibly replicating the behavior of the borough itself. This is really interesting, and I don't know exactly how to interpret it. This is the actual number of proprietors, and I'm showing it to you because I just don't understand the mechanism through which this is happening. Is that jobs are becoming more plentiful and therefore people are less likely to be proprietors? Not entirely sure. The other one I'm not showing you that maybe is consistent with your story, Bob, is that when I look at dividends, dividends decrease at a very precipitous rate. And dividends that are received by residents. And I don't know what, I mean, just a very significant decline. I don't know whether it's part of the story of migration of well-off individuals. It's not here because I haven't thought through what's going on.
I mean, this is consistent with sort of two things. It's consistent with sort of resource curse thought. When there's a really good employer, people go there rather than start their own.
Yeah.
But it's also consistent. I mean, I found in other places, if you have sort of a real business in a rural borough, often you incorporate it elsewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that pre-intervention match so bad for almost everybody? Especially in those early years in 80.
These are absolute number of proprietors. Oh, sorry, log of proprietor. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, this variable, I'm not sure even how to interpret, because a proprietor across places varies so much, right? And so the only definition is that it's basically people that either don't employ anybody else or that have something that's registered to their name. This is the earnings. These are earnings, per capita earnings. This is the definition of earnings, and this is what happened to them. Yeah, so I mean that's essentially the story with earnings. And then when I do, and this is income, and again, it's everything under the sun: labor, land, capital used in the production of services such as person. This is what's happening with income, per capita income. And then, and I'm skipping through these because. And this is the one where I find a huge effect. This is wages and salaries per capita. And in that case, it's just unambiguously the biggest effect across all the units that I'm analyzing.
Okay, now I'm turning my hand around why wages and salaries would be so much.
Well, and this gets back to the minutia of the construction of the dome, of how I'm constructing this stuff, right? And so look at the units, or look at the boroughs that I am using to construct how the borough would have evolved, right? And those are different than the ones that I was using to construct the best match for earnings. And so one of the ways in which to potentially get around this is to lock the units that are creating it and say, I'm just gonna estimate this using the same units.
So do you?
Because in what I'm showing you, Bob, I'm trying to replicate the variable that I'm showing you every time, irrespective of who's created it, right? And so I'm basically saying, I would like some combination of boroughs to give me the best pre-intervention match possible. And then I am looking through it, right? And so, I'm doing this for every single one separately, right? And so I'm saying for employment, get me the combination of boroughs that mimics the employment in the Northwest Arctic Borough before it. And so obviously the effects are going to be dependent on how well that combination of those units has evolved.
So the dotted line there is is using those four dirt
Every,
roads.
yeah, exactly.
Every-
In,
I
in,
didn't
every,
catch
in,
that.
in
I
every
got it.
single one of these, I'm using the combination of the boroughs to create the dashed line. And and the difference between the actual and the combination is what I'm interpreting as the effect.
Okay.
But I am not locking these boroughs
Across,
across
yeah,
all
right,
of them.
I get it.
I'm just trying to replicate the best twin for each one of them, right? And so, which is potentially better from estimating the true effect of that particular variable, but it makes comparison across
Right, I get it.
potentially problematic.
I'm wondering if that responds to the question I had too, which is, the Northwest Arctic Borough wasn't actually a borough.
Till
before-
86, yeah.
Right. Whereas other boroughs that you're using to compare it against, there was obviously some kind of economic development there that could support the cost of a borough.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And so I'm starting in 79, right? And so
I'm sorry, are you using boroughs or census areas?
I'm using both. I'm using everything that I have. I'm using boroughs and census areas.
You
And so,
are using-
yeah. I'm using boroughs and so there are only 18 boroughs / census areas for which I have complete data from 79 onward, and I'm using everything. Yeah, and so I guess in that case, it's getting to it. I mean, the other thing that potentially is comforting is that even pre-creation of the borough, those variables are actually moving in the same way, or they're matching. Yeah.
And,
So
and do you pick the donors based on the pre?
I'm trying to minimize the difference between the variable in the variable of interest in the pre-intervention period. Between 79 and 88, I'm basically trying to minimize the difference between per capita earnings in the actual and those combinations. And so every time I'm basically forcing it to just give me the best match possible, and then I use that match to take it forward. Yeah.
This would be a dumb question, but so is it just a weight of the variables, or is it a weight of the variables based on some covariates that are
It's
determined?
based on the covariates, yeah. So there is a V matrix that I'm trying to minimize the mean squared predicted error in the predictors.
And so then you have some fixed effects for each area, and then a bunch of other covariates.
Yeah, well, I mean that's what I was showing you here, is that this is essentially the construction, right? And so I have a time fixed effect, and then I have a time varying coefficient on observables, and then I have a time varying coefficient on unobservables. Yeah. So because we have another paper to go through, this is essentially what my conclusion, and there is a maybe there in parentheses, right? And so, because like I said, I think that it's suggestive. I think that there is a lot of information here to potentially tell a story. I think there are lower bound estimates. I think that there are, and these are some of the things that you guys mentioned as well. And so, and this is what's yet to be done. This is the stuff that some of you have raised. And maybe restricting the pool of boroughs or donors to just ones that, for example, received absolutely nothing. Thinking about timing, maybe doing placebos with timing a little bit, seeing if there is something that I can construct there.
So is there a measure for how good your assumption is on donors? Is there a metric that you can show how good that assumption is to use those donors and not other donors?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what so it's a mean square predicted error that's basically creating as good. So it's a minimization procedure that basically tries to minimize how much the distance is, right? And so it's picking the pool that best replicates that behavior, right? And so in the pre-intervention. So in essence, the pool that I use is the one that does the best job. And that's what I was telling Bob, is that the danger here is that if I try to lock the same boroughs to create all the variables, then I am basically, I'm foregoing the ability to minimize that mean squared predicted error, right? And so I'm saying, I'm not going to be creating the best match, but I'm going to be able to compare across units, across variables. Okay, so that's essentially where this is. Like I said, it's a work in process as opposed to progress, meaning that there is a lot to be done. So this is the second one. And this is using the North Slope Borough, and it's really trying to ask a very, very simple question that the literature is very silent on, is when oil prices go up, do local residents of the North Slope Borough benefit, right? And so is employment of residents sensitive to oil price increases, right? And so one of the nice things about Alaska is that thankfully we have employment by place of residence in addition to employment by place of work, right? And so because of the PFD, we're able to essentially determine who works where and also where do they reside. And so this exercise essentially just goes through both the Bureau of Economic Analysis data, which is constructed by place of work, and then uses a LARI data, which is constructed by place of residence, and the comparability there is not perfect, but it basically says, all right, in 2000, and I'm going to use 2006 as the intervention, right, because average oil prices went up significantly post-2006, and I'm going to be asking the very basic question of, has the North Slope Borough evolved differently relative to the rest of the state post-2006, right? And so, and I'm going to be answering that question using both employment by place of work and employment by place of residence, right? And so, can we detect an effect in terms of employment if we were to use a measure that basically disregards where people live, and then can we detect an effect once we lock the variable to just the place where people live? So you guys know this stuff, so I don't need to tell it to you. And this is, and we're not going to be talking about taxes today. So and this is stolen from other reports, but the importance of the North Slope Borough. This is the thing that I'm using to basically try to argue that this is a worthy question, and we should potentially detect something, right? And so the pushback on this question is, why in the world would you expect residents to benefit? And I make this argument as a first argument that revenues shot up post-2006. And again, just to cheat, and this is low tech, I'm going to show you the paper. These are revenues. So this is what happened to revenues in North Slope Borough post-2006, right? And so local government revenues, so more than 70% of all revenues are coming from property tax, and they went up significantly post-2006. These are oil prices over time. And hint, hint, these are percent changes in employment by place of work and employment by place of residence. And so what you're seeing here is the percent change in employment by place of work that just goes up, right? And so this has both residents and non-residents in it, and this just has residents in it. Right? And so the orange line is basically capturing percent change in employment irrespective of where the individual lives, and then the green line is capturing employment, percent change in employment only if the individual actually resides in the North Slope Borough.
What's the percentage of?
So 60%.
What's the percentage of rural work of oil industry workforce is captured by locals?
Very, very negligible.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No. But that's what I'm saying. So 60% of the population is working for the local government, right? And in the private sector, professional and business services, healthcare, are essentially the drivers of the private sector economy from a resident standpoint, right? And so I don't expect direct effects. However, I can make the argument that the riches that the local government revenue is receiving should potentially be translated in jobs. Additionally, the service companies that are linked to the industrial complex are subsidiaries of the regional corporation, and so potentially, it's an empirical question whether or not residents are benefiting from it, and the two channels that make the most sense are either the service sector that potentially goes up when they employ more people, or the local government starts spending more money and therefore they create jobs, right? And so, and I don't know a priori whether that's true or not, but it's an empirical question in my mind anyway. I'm gonna skip this, I've bored you enough. So, this just basically repeats what. And like I said, one of the reasons why I'm doing this exercise, obviously it matters to Alaska, and I think that we could learn a lot from it, because again, if original residents are benefiting from some of these developments, then there may be a case to divert resources towards some of those places. And one of the other things why this is neat is that the literature, like I said, does not have data by place of residence. There are essentially two papers that have attempted to do this. One in Brazil, one in Peru. The one in Brazil finds that the results of mining on local residents, they have administrative good data, essentially do not improve the standards of living. The one in Peru finds very, very big effects. But a lot of the criticism on that work is that the institutional factors outside of the US are so different than the ones in the US that comparability basically weakens essentially what we can draw to learn from this. And I'm suggesting that this is a really neat case study to try and basically add to that stuff. So this is what I'm using. These are the two pieces of information that I'm using. This is place of work. This has in it essentially residents and non-residents. And then I'm using a lorry that basically, arguably, only has in it people that are residing in North Slope Borough. This is what I'm estimating. I'm estimating two very simple things. Basically, what I'm trying to capture is this here. This is telling me some outcome variable for the unit of interest. This is an indicator variable of whether or not you're the North Slope Borough. This is 1 after 2006 and 0 beforehand. This is a time fixed effect that captures anything that's going on across the state. And this is a borough specific time fixed effect that's capturing anything that's time invariant. And so essentially what I'm trying to estimate is this beta that tells me whether or not the North Slope Borough has grown faster or slower relative to the rest of the state post 2006, and then I come back and I basically, rather than just estimating an average effect, I basically, and this is 2001 to 2013, I estimate a dynamic effect, which basically, this is the coefficient of interest that's estimating how did the North Slope Borough, how did the difference between the North Slope Borough and the rest of the state behave relative to that difference in 2001. And I'll show you this in a second. So this is by place of work. So this is telling me, this is the coefficient on employment. This is all employment, right? So this is telling me that post 2006, employment by place of work grew 30% faster than the rest of the state post 2006, right? And so if I were to use employment by place of work, the effects speak for themselves. And again, I have log employment on the left-hand side. So that, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So all is statewide.
No, sorry. So this is all employment, and this is wage and salary employment. This is proprietary employment. This is private employment.
Is this for the statewide or for the North Slope?
No, this is for this coefficient is for the North Slope Borough. This is the North Slope Borough's growth relative to the rest of the state. So this is post 2006. This is basically a difference in relative growth post 2006 relative to pre 2006, and it's telling me that after that shock, so essentially there was a boom in the most spatially proximate borough that was not mimicked in the rest of the state, and so we're seeing very, very large employment effects when I use employment by place of work. Yeah.
But I think what maybe Bob might be getting at, that's for any person can live anywhere in the state, they just have to work on the North Slope.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So it's by place of work. So
Yeah.
those are just, so that's capturing
No, I'm-
the effect if I were to disregard where the individual lives, but it's still just employment at the North Slope, right? So that's telling me employment at the North Slope increased faster than the control, right? Right? And so essentially, not terribly surprising, employment goes up when oil prices go up, right? Now, the question that is of interest is, are the residents benefiting from this increase? And, well, before that, these are the dynamic effects of that same relationship, and this is essentially total employment by place of work, and this is just a 95% confidence interval, and essentially what it tells you is there was no effect pre-intervention, and then as soon as we get past 2006, there was a very sharp increase. These are the yearly coefficients, if you will. There was a very significant decrease, and you can ignore this because there's a problem with one of the variables. I haven't updated it. I've run it, but I haven't updated it. So this is telling me that essentially wage and salary employment, these are essentially all variations of one another. And so there is basically that 30% effect that receives a very sharp increase immediately and then stabilizes. And these are the effects by place of residence.
They're negative.
So
They're negative.
could it be negative because if you're looking at fuel prices going up or crude prices going up, that also means that household fuel prices are going up and employers' fuel prices are also going up. Is that something that would depress employment
They have free natural gas.
in Barrow?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But I guess that's probably.
I mean,
I think that's where the Russell Borough is where the headquarters.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it is.
the thing that's most, I mean, that could be a channel. The thing that's most puzzling is that this decline, so in the private sector, there was none, right? When I just look at private sector, there is no effect whatsoever, meaning that there was none. Local government is what grew. So this is not telling us that local government employment has decreased. It's telling us that it grew at a slower rate relative to the controls post-2006, right? And so, and because 60% of the employment is in local government, that's what's driving the total effect. Now, I can't think of what that mechanism is that would, meaning, on the one hand, local government revenues were increasing, but unless there was a decline in population, which explains the decline in local government employment, it's tough to weave a story there. Yeah.
Well, one thing I'm wondering is, I guess the percentage of people either unemployed or in the workforce, because during that time you also had a flood of money coming into these communities, which sometimes doesn't always lead to positive actions by people. And I mean, it could be just some social ills increased, and therefore people might not no longer be in the workforce.
Yeah, that, actually, I was gonna comment on that as well, because in some of the studies it's shown that, you know, when you ask people in some of those communities, you know, why aren't you working, they say, you know, because I need more time for subsistence. And so if they were getting increased payments from their regional corporation during that time period, their income may have gone up enough that they then stopped working.
I have a different take. I'm wondering.
Do tell, Mr. Berman.
Did you do this employment per capita? What happened to the population?
I can do it. The population did not change a lot. I remember you bringing that up, and I thought that that was one of the mechanisms initially. But I don't remember. I mean, I'll check it, but I don't remember it being. So again, like I said, this is. It's not telling us that local government employment has decreased, because it didn't. It's just that it did not increase at the same pace as some of the other places, right? And so,
That's right.
yeah.
So the
I mean, it seems like,
decrease, but it has to, did it increase, did it decrease relative to so many other places?
Right.
but it seems like, I'm sorry, I just got somebody off.
I'm just curious, when you look at people who are employed in or people who live in North Slope Borough.
Yep.
And
These
people
are these
who
people.
live elsewhere.
in the elsewhere group, did you distinguish between elsewhere in Alaska and outside?
No, so this is essentially, the first analysis just says, as long as you work in the North Slope Borough, you're counted in this.
Right.
In this one, it's just people that are actually residing in the borough per PFD and unemployment insurance matches, essentially, right? And
But
so,
if there was an impact in other boroughs from people in other boroughs who came to work in the North Slope,
Uh-huh.
as opposed to people who are outside, who go home outside.
so what would that do?
I don't think that changes this, but I mean, it's of interest, say, for an Alaskan.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have yet to do, and again, and this gets us to the controls, here I'm using the rest of the state as controls, essentially. And one could make the argument that there are a lot of boroughs that do not belong in that zero or in the controls for this analysis. And maybe the more appropriate comparison are other units of similar size or of similar economies without the resource in order to get at a better estimate. Yes.
It seems like the reason why this could be negative is if this is a comparison with the rest of the state.
Yeah.
And the rest of the state benefit from high oil prices. And the
Wait,
North
no,
Slope-
yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. But the argument I was making initially is, shouldn't you expect that the place that's closest to the resource is the one that benefits the most?
Well, if the benefit comes by way of property taxes.
Right, which it does.
Right, then you've consciously made a choice to, I mean, oil prices go like this.
Yep.
Property taxes go slowly.
Yep.
And so you've made a choice, typically, one of the reasons you use property taxes is to, so you don't go up as much to the high, but you also don't go down as much as the low. You have a standard.
But they did go up quite a bit, right? And so.
Right, but not as much as the rest.
Sure, yeah, and I mean that certainly could be the channel, right? And so, and then in that case, we would be focusing on the private sector and asking whether or not the increase in oil prices has benefited the private sector.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah.
Would it be worthwhile just as a robustness check, then use this as a lower bound, and then pick some sparsely populated counties in Maine.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, like I said, the robustness checks are something I have not done because I was trying to think about this. I mean, a lot of the questions, a lot of the things that you guys have raised are certainly worth trying.
Why did you decide to go with the D&D and not the synthetic?
I'm writing a file to do the SCM, and so I just wanted to see the average effect initially because I was trying to think about.
I mean, how have you looked at the pre-intervention trends between the control and the?
Yeah, they don't look bad, but yeah, I mean that's a good point. I should do an SEM for this as well. It was really curious that the results were going in different directions, and so I need to check. But yeah.
Yeah, the other thing you might, I don't know how you do this, but there are other ways that they could benefit with outside of jobs. I mean, the money could have gone to savings. I know that North Slope Borough has a permanent fund kind of thing. Now, it could have gone towards paying down debt, which is something that they've had a policy of doing. And it could be that the CIP projects are winding down. I mean, there's a lot of noise.
No, fair enough. I tried to be careful in the paper to say this looks at employment, right? And so, and I do have revenue that's detailed, and I have expenditures that are detailed. They're not part of the paper right now, but I'm wondering whether they belong in that same analysis or they should be treated completely separate by saying, yes, acknowledge limitations, because you're right that the channels are not immediately clear, and they could be doing something wonderful with that money. It's just that I would have expected, again, I mean, to Bob's point, that the place that's closest to the resource would be one where you could detect something from an employment standpoint.
I was thinking, I know one thing they did with the money that's not showing up here.
Do tell.
They're subsidizing fuel prices in all the communities that don't have natural gas, and obviously those subsidies had to go up a lot.
And so people are better off, and so we shouldn't expect that once they're better off, they're gonna find. No. Or maybe they're doing more subsistence as a result, and therefore that's why.
People in Point Hope have the same cost of living as they did before the oil price went up, but the borough's having to spend a lot more money to keep it that way.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean,
It's
it seems because there's one or two real sources of employment.
correct.
That you just can go to the numbers and chase down the reasons, right? That is, you have the statistics, but it's not, it shouldn't be, you should just, if you go to the North Slope numbers and you go, where did this money go? You should be able to chase down a story that hopefully matches the numbers.
But the story is still not. I mean, the story could say, for example, to Lee's point, that they saved the money, right? And that's why we're not experiencing. Yeah, that's fair.
I mean, it just seems like it just seems like this is
The natural progression
the
of.
first chapter.
Sure.
And like, okay, well, it's like seeing the first half of like Walt Disney. I want to go see the second half
Who?
next week.
I don't know. So again, this is the same thing. These are the time varying effects, and this is a lot noisier. And then these are just some other outcomes that I estimated as well. And I was trying to see what's going on, whether there is something of interest. One of the things that's inconsistent with everything that I'm finding is that I find the number of unemployment insurance claimants decreased, and so I don't know exactly what to do with that bit of information, given the other results, because I guess that tells us about how many people were unemployed beforehand, right? And so that could be telling us that people that are benefiting, although the benefits in general are smaller than other places, the people that are benefiting are more likely to have been unemployed in North Slope Borough, which could be a good mechanism, right? And so this is by place of residence as well. Yeah. So, I mean, it could be telling us that the growth was not as large as other places. However, the people that are benefiting tend to be ones that were previously unemployed, which could be a really good thing. Because the data is not available for everybody. Yeah.
And that was again relative to other boroughs.
Relative to other boroughs, yes. Yeah, here I'm using basically any borough that's not the North Slope as a zero or as a control, essentially, yeah. So it's relative to other boroughs, relative to pre-2006, right? And so this is essentially my, I should have add a maybe on this one as well. So massive increase when employment is measured by place of employment. Essentially no effect, no positive effect when we measure it by place of residence. You guys have pointed out that there could be these other benefits that are not mentioned, that are not captured by employment. But again, restricting it to just an employment conversation, it seems like all the benefits as a result of the most recent oil boom or oil price increase are accruing to non-residents from an employment perspective. And that's that.
I'd be interested in seeing that from an income perspective. Resident
Yeah.
income change.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that unfortunately you're not going to be able to do. Because,
Tell us.
I'm just saying, well, I'm impressed with how much effort you've gone to tease information out of it.
Oh, here is the insult coming.
No, that's not it. If I insult somebody, it's not aimed at you, but essentially, I believe the place of work data. I don't believe the place of residence data necessarily, and that's because I know a little bit too much about how they do it. And here's well, first of all, for the North Slope with your Lari data, it's where people file their PFDs from, so that's a definition of residence. I don't really know what the oil workers do, but maybe Alyssa could find out and tell you. But one of the things, how many people are actually filing dividend applications from dead?
The differences in employment numbers are large enough to where I would be really surprised.
Well, we know that a lot of people are but that's a question. It's maybe Alyssa can answer that. It's like, go back and look at how many people are actually filing PFDs from Prudhoe Bay or Dead Horse, because those are not,
But that's a bias that goes towards me finding an effect, Matt.
That's right. But in terms of but that's just one thing. And the bigger problem is the BEA's residence adjustment when you go to income. the DEA is using the American Community Survey.
Right.
And you definitely can't use the North Slope Borough because they were using the American Community Survey pre-2010 to adjust the data after 2010. And the census revised their method and dumped a whole bunch of North Slope oil workers and told them to say they were residents after 2010, but the pre-2010 period they're not counted as residents. So the residence adjustment is sort of screwy.
So no income chapter.
So you don't, not a North Slope Borough, but in the Red Dog mine, I mean, that's an interesting question, because the residence adjustment, you know, well, who's working, that's the people who are working at Red Dog primarily, who aren't living in the
It's much harder to find, yeah.
and there might be, what, 300 or 400 people
Sure.
who are doing that, maybe 500?
Yeah, it's less, so like I said, it's 610, and they say that 144 or 150 are shareholder residents. So
there's more
450
shareholders
maybe,
than
yeah.
there are residents as well. So shareholder workers are not necessarily residents of the borough.
So 57% are shareholders, but a subset of that 57%, 155 of 300 or so are actually resident shareholders.
Yeah, so the challenge is in finding those people in the DEA, where the DEA has actually found them and appropriately adjusted the residence.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an exercise I'm going to undertake, but yes.
No, you don't want to do that. The
Yeah.
DEA's done it, and the point is they're not that many people, and they're
Sure.
scattered, they may be in Anchorage or Matsu or something
Fair
like
enough.
that. So the probability that the American community, because using American Community Survey responses of where do you work versus where do you live.
Right.
And so that they have to find these people in the American Community Survey to know that they are adjusting their residence. And I did a back of the envelope calculation. I think there are probably maybe half a dozen of those in the ACS
Yeah, no, that's
each
probably
year.
true.
So it's pretty, yeah, they might or might not get it.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, there are limitations. The question is, how much can we use from this data in order to answer these questions? I think quite a bit, caveat.
Well,
but,
the point is, that's one of the reasons why there might be an effect which is hard to find. Because the data
yeah, no, but that's why I'm saying that I believe what I'm finding is a lower bound, right? And so, given everything else. But, yeah, so that's all I have. Thank you all for coming. Sorry for ruining your lunch.